The rain came down in sheets, soaking my sneakers as I sprinted through the alley, heart pounding like a drum in a parade. I didn't care that my jeans were slipping, the belt long gone in my rush to escape the bar's chaos, spilled drink, a shouted slur, and fists flying before I could blink. I just needed to get away. But then he was there, grabbing my arm, steadying me as my pants sagged embarrassingly low. "Easy, man," he said, his voice low and warm, cutting through the storm. His name was Julian Torres, and in that moment, under the flickering streetlight, his brown eyes held a kindness I hadn't seen in years. He knelt, tugging my jeans up with a chuckle, his fingers brushing my waist just long enough to send a jolt through me I couldn't explain. "I'm Ethan Cole, 24, a graphic designer scraping by in Brooklyn, and I'd never been good at reading people. Growing up in a small Ohio town, I learned to keep my head down, my feelings locked tight. Being gay wasn't something you shouted about where I came from, not unless you wanted trouble. I'd moved to New York for freedom, but freedom felt like a myth when you're dodging drunk bigots in dive bars. That night, though, Julian didn't just pull up my pants. He pulled me into something I wasn't ready for. We ducked into a 24-hour diner, the kind with sticky booths and coffee that tasted like regret. My clothes clung to me, cold and heavy, but Julian's presence was a furnace. He was older, maybe 30, with a lean build and a tattoo peeking out from his sleeve, a crescent moon inked in black. He worked as a paramedic, he told me, his voice steady but laced with something raw, like he'd seen too much but still believed in saving people. "You okay?" he asked, sliding a mug of coffee my way. His gaze was direct, searching, and I felt exposed, like he could see the parts of me I'd buried. I nodded, mumbling about the fight at the bar, how I'd been there with friends but ended up alone when things got ugly. I didn't mention the guy who'd called me a slur, or how I'd frozen, too scared to swing back. Julian leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "You don't have to go through that alone. You know." His words were simple, but they hit like a punch. I wanted to believe him, but trust was a luxury I couldn't afford. Still, when he offered to walk me home, I didn't say no. The streets of Brooklyn were quieter now, the rain reduced to a drizzle. Julian talked about his job, about the adrenaline of saving lives and the weight of losing them. I listened, hanging on to his every word, the way his lips curved when he laughed. At my apartment door, he hesitated, his hand brushing mine again. "You're stronger than you think, Ethan," he said, and I swear my heart forgot how to beat. Days turned into weeks, and Julian became a constant I hadn't expected. We'd meet for coffee, or he'd text me after a long shift, sharing stories of his day. He was Puerto Rican, raised in the Bronx, and his pride in his roots shone through in every story he told his abuela's cooking, the salsa music that filled his childhood home. I opened up too, bit by bit, about my designs, my dreams of making art that mattered. But I never told him how my pulse raced when he smiled, or how I'd lie awake replaying the night he helped me in that alley. One evening, we ended up at Prospect Park, sprawled on a blanket under the stars. The city hummed in the distance, but it felt like we were in our own world. Julian turned to me, his face half lit by moonlight. "You ever feel like you're hiding from yourself?" he asked, his voice soft but heavy. I froze. He wasn't just talking about me, he was talking about us. The air crackled with what we weren't saying, and I wanted to lean in, to close the gap, but fear clawed at me. What if I was wrong? What if this was just kindness, not something more? Before I could answer, his phone buzzed, a call from work. He had to go, but not before his hand lingered on my shoulder, warm and steady. "We'll talk soon," he promised, and I watched him disappear into the night, my heart a tangled mess of hope and dread. The next morning, I woke to a text from Julian. Meet me at the diner tonight. Got something to tell you. My stomach flipped. Was this it? The moment I'd been too scared to name. I spent the day sketching, trying to distract myself, but every line I drew turned into the curve of his jaw, the spark in his eyes. By evening, I was a wreck, pacing outside the diner, my palms sweaty despite the autumn chill. He was already there, sitting in our usual booth, but something was off. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and his hands fidgeted with a napkin. Ethan, he started, his voice quieter than usual. There's something I need to say. My heart sank. This wasn't the confession I'd hoped for. It was something heavier, something that could change everything. Julian's eyes were fixed on the table, his fingers shredding the napkin into tiny pieces. I'm leaving, Ethan, he said, the words landing like a blow. Got a job offer in Chicago. Better pay, better hours. I'm moving in 2 weeks. My mouth went dry, and the diner's neon lights seemed to blur. I wanted to ask why, to beg him to stay, but all I managed was a week. Oh. He looked up, his gaze locking onto mine. It's not just the job, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. There's someone there. Someone I used to know. My chest tightened. Someone. A past love. A new one. I didn't dare ask, but the silence between us screamed with questions neither of us could voice. The rest of the night was a haze. We talked, but the ease we'd built over weeks was gone, replaced by a tension I couldn't shake. When we parted ways, his hug lingered, his breath warm against my ear. You'll be okay, Ethan, he said, but it felt like he was convincing himself as much as me. I walked home alone, the city's pulse mocking my own erratic heartbeat. The next week was torture. I threw myself into work, designing logos for clients I didn't care about, but every sketch reminded me of Julian. My friends noticed I was off. Lila, my best friend since college, cornered me at a coffee shop. Spill it, Ethan, she said, her blue eyes narrowing. You've been moping like someone stole your dog. I told her about Julian, leaving out the part where my heart felt like it was being carved out. She sighed, stirring her latte. You've got it bad. Huh? Tell him how you feel before he leaves. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But every time I picked up my phone to text him, fear stopped me. What if he didn't feel the same? What if I ruined the only real connection I'd had in years? Instead, I avoided him, dodging his texts, claiming I was busy. But Julian wasn't one to give up. On his last night in New York, he showed up at my apartment, his paramedic uniform wrinkled from a double shift. You've been ghosting me, he said, leaning against the doorframe, his eyes searching mine. Did I do something wrong? The vulnerability in his voice cracked something in me. I let him in, and we sat on my worn-out couch, the space between us heavy with unsaid words. I wanted to tell him everything, how his laugh made my world brighter, how his touch lingered in my dreams, but I couldn't find the courage. Instead, I asked about Chicago. He talked about the job, the city, but his eyes kept drifting to me, like he was memorizing my face. I'm gonna miss this, he said finally, gesturing vaguely at the space between us. My throat tightened. Me too, I whispered, and for a moment, I thought he might lean in, might close the distance I was too scared to bridge. But he didn't. He just stood, gave me a sad smile, and left. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my door. Ethan, you're braver than you know. Don't hide forever. Jay. I clutched it, my eyes stinging, and made a decision. I couldn't let him go without knowing the truth. I grabbed my jacket and ran to the train station, where he'd told me he'd be catching an early train to the airport. The platform was crowded, but I spotted him, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his head bowed. "Julian," I shouted, pushing through the crowd. He turned, surprise flashing across his face. My heart was in my throat, but I didn't stop. "I need to tell you something," I said, breathless. I'm in love with you. I've been too scared to say it, but I can't let you leave without knowing." The words spilled out, raw and unpolished, and for a moment, the world stopped. Julian's eyes widened, and then softened. He stepped closer, his hand grazing my cheek. "Ethan," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've been falling for you since that night in the alley." My heart soared, but before I could respond, he added, "But I can't stay. Not now." The platform seemed to tilt beneath me. He was still leaving. The confession I'd staked everything on wasn't enough. He pulled me into a hug, his arms strong and warm, and whispered, "This isn't goodbye. Not forever." Then he was gone, swallowed by the train's departure. I stood there, numb, as the crowd moved around me, the note in my pocket feeling like both a lifeline and a weight. Months passed, and New York felt emptier without Julian. I threw myself into my art, channeling my heartbreak into vibrant designs that caught the eye of a local gallery. They offered me a small exhibit, a chance to show my work to the world. It was a dream come true, but every sketch I made carried a piece of him, the curve of his smile, the warmth of his eyes. I wondered if he was happy in Chicago, if he'd found the someone he'd mentioned. Lila dragged me out of my funk, forcing me to join her at a queer art event in Manhattan. The room buzzed with energy painters, poets, activists, all celebrating who they were without shame. I envied their courage. I was still hiding, still afraid to fully embrace who I was. But that night, something shifted. A poet read a piece about love that dared to exist despite the world's judgment, and I felt Julian's note burning in my pocket. "Don't hide forever." I started going to more events, meeting people who made me feel seen. There was Marcus, a photographer with a laugh like summer, and Aisha, a writer who challenged me to be honest in my work. They became my found family, pushing me to confront the parts of myself I'd buried. But even as I grew, Julian lingered in my thoughts. We texted, sometimes brief, careful messages about our lives, but it wasn't the same. I missed him, and the ache didn't fade. One night, I got a call from an unknown number. It was Julian, his voice shaky. "Ethan, I need to see you," he said. "I'm back in New York. Just for a few days." My heart raced as I agreed to meet him at our old diner. When I walked in, he was there, looking tired but still breathtaking, his tattooed arm resting on the table. He stood, pulling me into a hug that felt like coming home. He told me about Chicago, how the job was good, but the city felt wrong. The someone was an ex, a fleeting attempt to move on that had failed. "I kept thinking about you," he admitted, his eyes locked on mine. "I was scared too, Ethan. Scared of what this could mean, of messing it up. But I'm here now, and I don't want to run anymore." My breath caught. This was the moment I dreamed of, but fear still gnawed at me. Could I trust this? Could I trust us? We spent the night walking the city, talking about everything we'd held back. He told me about his own struggles growing up in a family that didn't understand him, fighting to be proud of who he was. I shared my fears, the weight of my past, the way I'd always felt like I had to shrink myself to fit. By the time we reached the Brooklyn Bridge, the city sparkling below us, I felt lighter than I ever had. Julian stopped, turning to face me. "I want to try, Ethan," he said, his voice steady. "You and me. No more hiding." My heart pounded. But this time, I didn't let fear win. I leaned in, and when our lips met, it was like the world finally made sense. The kiss was soft, then urgent, a promise of everything we could be. But life isn't a fairy tale. Julian had to go back to Chicago. His job, his life there, wasn't something he could just walk away from. We agreed to try long distance, but doubt crept in. Could we make it work? Would love be enough when miles and time zones stood between us? Long distance was harder than I'd imagined. We talked every day, video calls stretching into the night, but the screen couldn't capture the warmth of Julian's touch or the way his laugh filled a room. I poured myself into my art, my exhibit gaining traction, but every success felt hollow without him there. He sent me photos of Chicago's skyline, teasing me about New York's pizza superiority, but I could hear the strain in his voice. He was struggling too. One night, during a call, he looked exhausted, his eyes shadowed. I got offered a permanent position here, he said, his tone flat. But I don't know if I want it. My heart sank. I wanted him to come back, to be with me, but I couldn't ask him to give up his career. What do you want, Julian? I asked, my voice barely steady. He was quiet for a long time before saying, "You." That word changed everything. We started planning visiting Chicago, him coming back for weekends. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. I flew out for the first time in spring, nervous but giddy. When I saw him at the airport, his grin erased every doubt. We spent a week exploring the city, stealing kisses by Lake Michigan, laughing over burnt pancakes in his tiny apartment. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't hiding, not from him, not from myself. But the world wasn't done testing us. Back in New York, I faced my own battles. My exhibit drew attention, but not all of it was good. Online trolls targeted my work, calling it too queer, their words echoing the slurs from that night in the bar. I wanted to shrink again, to disappear, but Julian's voice was in my head, "You're braver than you know." I kept going, leaning on my friends, my art, and Julian's unwavering support. One evening, he surprised me with a visit. He'd taken a leave from work, showing up at my gallery opening with a bouquet of sunflowers, my favorite. The crowd faded as he pulled me close, whispering, "I'm proud of you." That night, we talked about the future plans, not just dreams. He was looking for jobs back in New York, ready to come home. Months later, Julian moved back. We found a small apartment in Brooklyn, a place to build something real. It wasn't easy. There were fights, doubts, moments when the world's judgment felt too heavy. But every time I faltered, Julian was there, steady as ever, reminding me we were worth it. And I reminded him too, because love isn't just one person saving the other, it's both of you, pulling each other up, over and over. One quiet morning, as we sat on our tiny balcony, coffee mugs in hand, I looked at him, his messy hair, his warm eyes, the crescent moon tattoo that started it all, and felt a peace I'd never known. We'd faced fear, distance, and our own insecurities, but we'd chosen each other. And that choice, that love, was the most human, most meaningful thing I'd ever done.